Ngoasheng. Asanda, thank you so much for your time on the lead this afternoon. We're seeing more and more parents rise up and support their children, validating their experiences and taking up these schools that are refusing to transform, schools that take a soft approach on racial incidents. What does this communicate? Does it mean their children who experience these racial incidents have probably raised issues before but were ignored by the institutions? Or could it be that the environment in those institutions is not conducive for these learners to be honest about their experiences, then warranting this intervention of parents?
I think it's both. I think it's that, if you were one of the unlucky few who ended up at a former white school in the early 90s or as far back as the 80s and 70s for some people, you will know that experiences of racism were not taken seriously by the schools. And in fact, for the longest time, they were for what we're going through in former whites-only schools. And it's only recently that people have started to take this to quite seriously. In particular, when we saw you silence, we amplify this year. So I think that, the coverage of racism in schools and the prominence of conversations on racism in school has led to parents taking children's complaints, which probably were there before, a lot more seriously. And children, parents are also seeing other parents at other schools taking up this and standing up for their children, and that's inspiring them to also do the same. And so I think we're going to see a lot more parents protesting. We're going to see a lot more students protesting because we live in a racist society, and this racism manifests itself in the office, it manifests itself in the university space, and it manifests itself, of course, in the school space. And so I'm not surprised that we're suddenly seeing this uprise, because this is an issue that has been going on for a long time and has been unchallenged and undealt with for too long.
And what I have picked up often is something almost has to happen, right, before the schools can take the initiatives to start diversity training or start being deliberate about their transformation agenda, or even review their code of conduct or policies around hair, for instance. So it's almost like they are okay to allow the status quo to continue until there's a protest. How important is it that all schools that are racially diverse start doing the actual work and not wait for learners to complain or protest?
Yeah, I think it is sad that people see racism as an event that we then have to respond to, that we then have to crisis manage, rather than understanding racism as something that people of color experience on a day-to-day basis, and something that we need to think about in the same way that, schools make considerations for COVID, and they have conversations about COVID, and they bring in the experts that are required for COVID. But when it comes to diversity, we've ignored this issue for so long, both as government has ignored this issue, the corporate sector has ignored this issue, and to an extent even universities have ignored this issue for some of the work that was done around Fees Must Fall, which some universities are continuing with that work in any case. So schools have gotten away with for time. The public and saying, we're dealing in South Africa with schools that are proud to declare that they are 74% white in a country that is 80% black. And so there's still a long way to go, and there's still a lot of work. And this is why the work that I do as a diversity trainer, I decided to go the route of building a diversity and social justice curriculum, because I realized that workshops were not going to be enough, and some of the work that had been done before was not going to be enough, because racism is taught in the sense that society teaches children from the age of 0 that this is how you treat black people and this is how you treat white people. And so we have to use the same instruments of socialization, i.e. schools, to teach children how to engage with diversity and how to deal with some of the issues that come up when you are a school and you are a community that is diverse.
I think we need to ask questions about the governing party as well. Some people have said, this is a revolution, seeing the parents come out to support their children. Enough is enough. Parents are rising up to seek this transformation and equal treatment in these former Model C schools. But the reality is, as you said, the issues have been raised before with the schools, right? Either by the students themselves or the parents, or even by some teachers. why then, 27 years into democracy, must we have such scenarios where parents have to protest to force institutions to look inward and transform? Is this indicative, perhaps, of the failure by the ANC government? I spoke to Satu in Mpumalanga earlier this week, and the secretary there told me last week that, it was last week in fact, that this shows that the ANC should be doing more to ensure that these schools actually do transform and understand that they're operating in this country that is also trying to push for transformation and inclusivity. Do you think the ANC is serious about that agenda?
Us as parents in particular, I think the ANC has, for too long gotten away with making the argument that their education departments are more focused on schools that are dealing with poverty, so they don't have the capacity to deal with what they see as privileged black children whose parents can afford to take their children to these schools, which are seen as former white. And I think also the ANC has failed us even further in that they have not built any new or enough new schools within suburbs that are South African schools built in the post-apartheid era, because part of the reason why white people in particular and white parents at these schools still see these schools as for them and not for black people is because they were built during apartheid, and during apartheid they belonged only to white people. And I think that the ANC, in failing to build more schools and allowing mainly private schools to be the ones that are bringing new education institutions into particularly suburban areas, they have allowed for this to happen. And also, they have failed in their duty of holding schools accountable, because private schools also need a license. Without that license, there is no private school that can operate. And so they haven't made one of the conditions, for example, of having a license that you have to show that you are capable of dealing with diversity, that you are going to protect children who are different and often are the minority and often are not catered for. And they have just continued with the assumption that somehow this issue of racism is going to solve itself, which is sad if you consider that the ANC are the very people who were fighting against apartheid and should, more than anybody, understand the systemic attack that racism is and the ways in which it manifests itself in society. And I want to add that it's not just the ANC that has failed us, it's also the Western Cape. And I speak as a parent in the Western Cape. The Western Cape Department of Education has failed us. And part of the reason why it is failing us is because the DA itself is still practicing this racial, colorblind policy making that doesn't even begin to acknowledge racism as a serious problem in society. And so while the government has policies that state that, you are allowed to have at least one African language outside of English within your institution, they then gave that power to the SGB, which means if the SGB is full of white parents, you're not going to see these African languages. And then secondly, you have affirmative action, you have black economic empowerment, but none of these policies are being implemented in the schools. If you look at the service providers that provide sports, they're white. If you look at the service providers that provide other extramurals, whether it's drama or chess or any other extramural, it's still mainly by white people for former white schools. And so unless we start thinking about schools as belonging to South Africa and everybody in South Africa, and we start thinking about service providers at all schools as needing to be as diverse as possible in order to represent the community and, the South African population, we're still going to see ourselves struggling. We're still going to see a lot more parents fighting against the insistent on Afrikaans instead of making sure that other African languages, which have a history of being denigrated and a history of not being respected in these schools, are not relegated to languages that are eventually going to die out because nobody is reading them and nobody is learning them. And these are some of the issues that if our government took this issue seriously, they would be dealing with it and they should be at the forefront of this. It shouldn't be people like me and other people who are doing diversity work who are leading this. It should be the government. It should be the South African human rights Human Rights Institute, who are leading these efforts, who are making sure that there's a curriculum, who are making sure that schools understand that the criteria for holding a license is being able to showcase that you can be a safe space for all kids, and in particular, Black kids. We know the history of South Africa is that a lot of these schools have not been safe spaces for Black children. And until our government starts to do something about it, starts to use the legislation that it already has and the sanctions that already exist, this is going to continue. And I'm glad that parents are finally taking a stand and are finally demanding what is rightfully theirs, because no child in this country should have to go through the pain of facing racism on a daily basis in the school where their parents are paying money, and shocking, even if they're not paying.
Yeah, it's just shocking that even now we're dealing with a situation where the ANC government only later does it want to also even review the curriculum and say, let's make it more Afrocentric. And you wonder, what are we doing over the last couple of years? But yeah, action now. Being late is better than doing nothing at all. That was diversity expert Asanda Ngoasheng. Thank you so much for your time.